And I think letting out the tears and letting out the feelings and being with our experiences, doing it well, even if it's quite messy. But even if we're doing our grief well, we can have the sense that we're doing it wrong because we're not happy again, we're not getting over it, or we're not back to normal, or any of those kinds of things.
As though our society has preconceived, not like it's not like written down, but our culture has this definition of how to grieve, and it doesn't match how to actually grieve. Hello,
Hey,
back again.
I'm so glad we're getting a chance to be back here.
Yeah, me too. So today we're talking about waves of grief, and we're going to be using a lot this metaphor of the ocean. So all of the oceanic terms that we use, just have that in the listener's mind if we're ocean talking right now. Why
Yes.
don't you take it away?
Okay, yeah. So let's set up this metaphor and then we'll talk some about how we both relate to it. So,
Okay.
the way I like to think of it is when we're first navigating the loss, especially if it's a surprise to us or we weren't expecting it. And it says, though we've been thrown into the surf, right? Barely knowing anything about waves or how to work ourselves in waves. Most of us react quite understandably with some survival reactivity of some kind, right? We're just trying to stay alive and doing whatever we, just trying to stay alive and doing whatever we need to survive this drowning barrage of waves. Many of us fight the waves in whatever way we can, or we run from the waves trying to get back up the shore, or we freeze up not knowing what to do, or some of us busy ourselves looking for ways to look like we know what we're doing, or looking for ways that we can help others who are in this surf around us. Somehow we start to get our feet under us a little. We start to get knocked over less by each wave. And then after a while, it sinks in that this is just what we have to deal with right now. Right? Wave after wave after wave. And then a lot of feelings of all kinds come up around this. And really, name a feeling, it can come up during the grieving process. And then we go on like that for some time, right? Barely making it through, but slowly, surely getting used to how it feels to be rocked by these waves. And then one day, for whatever reason, the ocean is just a little calmer. The waves are a little smaller or fewer and farther between. And we get our first glimpses at how each wave works individually as a thing in and of itself. And then we start to get more accustomed to riding the waves or occasionally ducking under them. And we start to be able to anticipate and navigate. And eventually, if we give ourselves time and practice, then we can learn to surf the waves, to be good at it, if you will, in our own ways. But we only get to this point if we practice. Then, if we get to that point, when we get to that point, even when the ocean is a torrent and the clouds are eating the horizon and, just like we can't see anything, the difference between ocean and horizon, we can still ride even those 100-foot waves. And it's worth keeping in mind that once we've been thrown into the ocean of grief, however that happens for us, there's no leaving it. We can get really good at riding the waves or not, but we just live at the shore now.
Mhm. That's such a beautiful analogy.
I find it so too. I find it both pretty apt, but also calming to my nervous system to think of it that way. Like, okay, this is a landscape I know something about, right? This is a thing that we can get used to. And it does seem to make sense of that experience we have of like, oh no, here it comes again. I thought I was done. Oh no, here it comes again. I thought I was done.
Yeah, and I think that concept of I thought it was done comes from a compartmentalization of emotions and of thinking, like, no, I dealt with grief, I'm done now.
Yeah.
And really deconstructing that that's not the way grief works.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember from our conversation about debunking the stages of grief that was something that you were emphasizing there, and I think is such an important point for people to hold in mind. It's not like we meet grief and then, okay, I've done the stage of grief and now I don't have to do that anymore. No, it's this washing, tumbling, mixed up wave, if you will. Yeah, all
Yeah.
kinds of stuff.
Yeah, and I want to add to that that I have seen many clients who don't realize that they're in the ocean until 2, 5, 10, 15 years after they have lost the person. And they'll have this huge epiphany in session that, oh, I never grieved my father who died 15 years ago. And so it's almost as though they are starting grief over, but they're not, but they're really facing the the water that they're in
Yeah.
and that they have been in.
Yes. I think there's a lot of us who the experience is so overwhelming for our nervous system at first that we basically can't attend to it, you know. And we, even though there are so many things that do need to be taken care of, we so dramatically hone our focus onto those to-do lists, you know, who we have to call, what has to be done, what has to be thrown away, what has to be cleaned up, that we forestall. You know, we kind of ignore for a while, but we're still there. And eventually, like you say,
Yeah.
we have to come to terms with that.
So it's almost the way that you described the metaphor of first you feel like you're drowning in it, and then eventually you realize there's a rhythm, and then eventually you learn to surf. What is It's almost as though those are different, I hate to use the word stages of grief, but it's almost as though those are different like processions of development through the getting to know the ocean. Can you dive deeper into each one of those?
All right, now we're really pulling out the ocean metaphors. Yeah, let's dive into that. Um, yeah, I think part of it is, again, and I think we'll wind up talking about this a number of times over the course of our conversations, but the brain just has such a difficult time coming to terms with what's happened, especially if it's sudden, especially if we weren't expecting it and we didn't get to see the actual person dying or their body afterward. Then our brain just really resists. And some of that resistance comes in the form of, and I think we'll definitely also talk more about this again at another time too. We have that survival reaction of like, oh no, am I going to be killed too? Am I going to die? Is something going to happen to me? Right. And even
Mm-hmm.
if we're not thinking that, like many of us wouldn't think that, like that our person is far away from us, whatever happened to them just happened to them. You know, my brother died from a heart attack. And so like, you know, I don't have any reason to think that my heart is also in danger, but my nervous system does. And so, yeah, I think many of us have that experience of, especially at first, some version of survival reactivity come up when we're thrown into the waves because it's just so overwhelming for the nervous system to come to terms with. And like I try to tuck into the metaphor, and like we've discussed before too, some folks do that through fighting. You know, they might get into some literal fights with like the funeral director or, you know, the hospital people or the coroner or each other over, you know, things that need to be done or not done. Or they distract themselves, you know, into substances or into all the to-do lists, as we mentioned, that they have to do, or into, any kind of psychological distractor, essentially, or
Mm-hmm.
avoidance. Or they've, like we said, they freeze up. They don't know what to do. They just stay in bed. That happened to me where there were a number of days where I just I just didn't have any energy. My system was turned down so far that I got out of bed, but I was still sleepy the entire day. And so I would just go back to bed.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was freeze. Or, like people who they their survival strategy is to appease or to be pleasing. And so they try to look like they're keeping it all together. They try to, not even cognitively, their system is running this program of trying to look like they have it all together or trying to get other people to be okay. So again, to be more direct in answering your question, I think it's just because the initial phase and not stage, but initial experience of a loss is so dramatic to the nervous system. We're still just trying to figure out what the heck is happening to us, to our people, to our in group. And then slowly but surely, especially if we attend to it, the nervous system becomes more accustomed to this truth. And both the loss is true and that we're not in danger becomes truer.
So, to summarize what you just said, is basically when you lose the person, your body goes first into fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, any combination of those. And that is that sensation of drowning, of total overwhelm, of I'm not safe. Therefore, I need to resort to one of these things in order to assure my safety.
Yeah, subconsciously, I mean, no one's choosing that. We wouldn't likely choose that. But
Subconsciously,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, our nervous system is
Yeah,
just trying to keep us alive because one of our people is gone.
yeah, yeah.
Such a striking thing to think about the nervous system just trying to figure it out. Like cognitively, in our thinking brains, we know, like my brother's heart disease is not catchy, like I can't get it just because I know that he had that. Um, but the nervous system still has to figure out, is the thing that was a danger to our in group or a member of our in group going to be a danger to this individual?
Hmm.
And that's such a hard thing for it to figure out. It takes time.
Hmm. Hmm.
I also think, and this is one of the reasons I think it helps if we know more about it. Is like I think knowing that it's coming is a way that helps our nervous system. Knowing that it's happened is a way that helps our nervous system attend to it. Seeing some version of them passing or having passed helps our nervous system. Going to the rites of passage that happen is another level of helping our nervous system. If we don't have those, then I think it makes it harder. There aren't the signposts that our nervous system is looking for.
Hmm. Hmm.
Thinking I wonder what you think about this. In the age of COVID, especially, I wonder, like, we didn't get to go to our rites of passage, as many of us, or things were forestalled, or we didn't get to be with our people when they passed. Um,
Yeah, so I just recently went to an open casket funeral, and it was my first ever open casket funeral I had attended. Um, and it honestly really freaked me out. I was like, whoa, that's like their body right there. Um, and it certainly left me with I called it an emotional hangover. Like the whole week after the funeral, I was affected so much more than I thought I would have been. And it's because the whole previous week I was really being super intentional about my grieving.
mm,
And then I was like, okay, I feel really, really like processed around this. I thought I was done with the ocean.
mhm, mhm. Well, you're a great
And then
surfer,
I
so
because I'm so experienced at
yes,
grieving, I'll say, cool, I
yeah, I
did
got
it.
this. Yeah,
And then I went to the open casket funeral, and it left this like really strong imprint of my mind. And I was like Googling, I was like, why do people do open casket funerals? Like, I don't want this. And it was like, it's to give you a sense of closure,
yeah,
like to see that person is
yeah,
there in that casket.
yeah.
Um, and the funeral also felt so much more dramatic than any funeral I had been
Mm,
to. They had the casket open before the service, and then they closed it right before the service. And they were like, okay, we're going to close the casket in 5 minutes. And then, like, all of the immediate family was like standing there, like sobbing as they were closing the casket. It was this really dramatic thing. And in retrospect, I'm thinking that was them closing it was so much more than closing a casket. It was them really
yeah,
like being like, okay, it's shut now. Like you're in there, you're sealed.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and so going the week after the funeral, I was almost debilitated by grief. And I didn't expect that to happen because the week before I had done so much healthy grief processing. Um, but now coming out of that, I'm feeling so much more closure around the loss. And I'm almost in retrospect grateful for the open casket but at the time I was like, this is weird.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hearing you talk about it, I was thinking about, I'm about to say the olden days, when, we would be with our people when they passed. It wasn't like they went anywhere. No one, we didn't have funeral directors. We didn't have mortuaries. We just,
You dug the hole
yeah.
in your land
Yeah.
and you laid the body in your land. Yeah, you were laboring
Yeah.
to finish their cycle.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think there's something really beautiful about that we've lost, that we're missing. But I also think there's a way in which that also would have been, probably really was supportive to the nervous systems of those who survived. In part because
Mm.
we created rituals around that too. Like they would bathe the body and they would prepare the body and then they would dress the body and then they would, had particular, burial things that they would do, that were specific to their community or their family or their larger village. So
Mhm.
we were steeped in these ways of coming to terms with it. And
Mhm.
now many of us have almost none of that, or the thing that's left for the majority of us is this funeral, right? This one day where we go all together with the people and we do the thing. And simultaneously there's this sense that, well, okay, like now we should be all done. You put them into the ground and that's the end. Now go back to your life. But
Mhm.
for the majority of people, that's when the grieving really starts. Like you're noting when when they
Mhm.
were closing the casket and the sobbing that started then, and or for you, like the emotional hangover you had after the funeral. There's a
Mhm.
way, whether we're the ones who are busy tidying up the details or not, like calling the people and packing things up and making things happen, we can still, there's still kind of a little bit of a forestalling. And then once this thing has happened, there's a finality, I think, that our systems attend to.
Mhm.
I don't think I really started grieving. Like, I think I was still, I was doing some crying. I was doing a lot of nervous system regulation and doing a fair amount of talking about it, processing it. I thought that I had done it, like you're saying. But then about a month to the day, I didn't even know it was a month to the day until I found myself on the floor howling. And then I kind of like looked up through my, bleary eyes at the calendar and I was like, oh my God, it's a month to the day that I found out. And I think there was this way in which whatever was happening for me before, I think it was mostly some kind of survival reactivity with little moments of coming out of that. But that's when I really got it, like we didn't have the funeral by then and there wasn't a memorial or celebration yet, but it was like my nervous system had that moment of, oh yeah, this is for real, this is a loss that's not coming back.
Mhm. Mhm. This episode is brought to you by the Center for Emotional Education and Sacramento Reiki Center, where we support full-time grievers every day. Many of our clients have tried everything and it still hasn't been enough. After our work together, they gain the tools and skills that they need to navigate their grief on their own. You can get more information at sacramentoreikicenter.com and centerforoemotionaleducation.com.
I want to set some context for some folks too. Over the course of these podcasts, they'll get to know us more and more. But would you be willing to share with us a little bit about because we refer to you as a surfer. Like, I know that you know grief. You're a full-time griever already. This latest loss was not
Mm-hmm.
it's not like this is new terrain for you.
Mm-hmm.
So would you be willing to say a little bit about your experience with being a full-time griever, and then also anything that you've noticed that has been different this round because of the level of knowledge you have about living at the ocean?
Yeah, so I would say my launch into the ocean was 8 years ago when my mother passed away. She died suddenly to a brain aneurysm. I was 21 years old, in a graduate program. Um, and I basically became non functional. I dropped out of my graduate program because I literally could not get myself to show up to class. Um, and then that kind of I was already sort of on this like healing journey of like learning all of these modalities. And then I sort of stepped away from that to go to grad school. And I was like, nope, can't step away from that. Need to go back into that. So that really got me to continue studying more healing arts, as opposed to academics. And then several years later, about 2 years ago now, I lost someone very, very close to me to suicide. I was on the phone with the people who found her body while they found her body. So that was like definitely, a super, super shock to the nervous system. We went straight to the place where her body was found, and then like the police were there, and that was a whole thing to deal with. And them like not letting us access our friends who were there with, in the home, and then navigating that house that they all lived in together. And that was a really, really big nervous system shock and everything shock, and catapulted me a lot. It got me to realize that I have PTSD and that I have had PTSD my entire life, but it got like so bad. I was like, oh, I have this. And I really had to face it and have had to work through that. And then just about 3 weeks ago, my cousin passed away to, drug overdose. And it's extremely likely that the drug overdose was because something was laced into the drugs that he didn't know he was taking. It was very much not an intentional, like he wasn't trying to like commit suicide. He was taking drugs and he took too much of the wrong thing. And if he was only taking what he thought he was taking, he would not have died from that. And it was something else laced into it. And so that was my first cousin. I come from a giant Mexican family. I have 155 cousins.
Wow.
So saying my cousin passed away isn't actually that big of a statement. It's like, well, yeah, like people die every day. Of course your cousin passed away. But saying that my first cousin passed away is a lot nearer and dearer to my heart. It's like someone who I grew up with, playing with, have known my whole life. I saw him most recently on the 4th of July, just this past year, a couple months ago. He lives in my metropolis that I live in. He has two young children. They are, I think, 3 and 7 years old. And so there's a lot of, in all of my grief process, I would say there's a lot of working through intergenerational trauma. So my like substance abuse struggle is really, it's not common in my family, but it happens in my family. There's like always like someone there that we know is struggling with it. And a few days after my cousin passed away, I was at Burning Man and a stranger offered me a piece of gum, and I was like, no. And in my head, I was like, that gum could be laced with a substance that could kill me. And so that's like that survival reactivity of. So I would say over the course of my grieving journey, the first was certainly the most disabling. It was like disabling is not, I'm not exaggerating. Like I was disabled by grief. And then when the next one happened 2 years ago, I was like, oh, here I am again. And then when the most recent one happened, I was like, oh, okay. And I've started to realize that the older I get, the more people I will know who will have died, and that's a part of growing older. And when my mother passed away, I really turned to seniors who I knew were the eldest living members of their family. And I was like, you've seen a lot of people die. Like, what's up with this? And I actually, through a matter of events, found myself at a um, community that was mostly seniors in Santa Barbara County. And I that was exactly where I needed to be. I needed to be held by seniors because I needed to ask them what it was like to lose their mothers. But there was one woman there who was 61 years old and her mother was still alive. And I was like, that's not fair. Like, you got to have your mom for your whole life. And she's like, oh, I'm so scared when my mom's going to die. I'm like, but you got to have her for 61 years. Like, you should just be grateful.
Mm.
And that's not to discredit her emotions or feelings about it. But
Really normal.
yeah. Yeah. So that's kind of my overview of my journey of grieving. Oh, and then I suppose I could also mention grieving my father. When I was 13, I turned him in for child abuse, and I have never seen him since. So as a teenager, I
Mm.
was also grieving him. And that wasn't a loss to death, but
Right.
that was a loss of a caregiver of mine,
Yeah.
that I was definitely grieving. And that was a complicated, I think all of my griefs have been complicated
Mm.
griefs. It's because very few, none of my griefs have like died of old age,
Mm-hmm.
um, which I think is what we're conditioned to expect.
Right.
We're conditioned to expect that you will lose your grandmother on her 97th day of a year around the sun,
Mm-hmm.
and it will be because of like liver failure or something like that.
Right.
Um, yeah, so none of my losses have been to I mean, it's the definition of natural cause is debatable,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
yeah, they've certainly been intense
Mm.
and complicated.
Yeah. So I appreciate you sharing that with the folks who are listening, in part because I think it's really useful for us to have this model and to know this of this, that no matter how experienced we are, no matter how much work we've done around grieving, no matter how many times we've been to the ocean, as it were, the waves can still be pretty potent. They can really still knock us down, and we can still go through, even if it's a faster version or a smaller version or a lighter version, much of the same process that we go through with any loss of a close one to us.
Hmm.
I'm also reminded, hearing your story, that one of the things that, in talking about this topic before we came here to talk about it, was this idea, and I want to make sure we have a chance to chat some about it here, that each wave, when we then experience them, is kind of a tiny version or a microcosm of our first experience being thrown into the waves, such that
Hmm.
even later waves that can come up months later, years later, can still have a level of survival reactivity that comes up, a level of destabilization that comes up where we have our feet knocked out from under us, a level of gasping for breath, a level of wondering, like, what's wrong with me? Why is this happening again? Another level of going through that period of thinking this is just how I'm going to be forever now. I'm just never going to not feel this way. Uh, Maybe even some of that, again, another version of I'm just crippled now. I'm just never going to be a whole person again. Then, like, continuing through each wave that we emote in all the ways that we emote, or suppress emoting in all the ways that we suppress emoting. And then, eventually every wave passes through. And then, like, we come out of the water and we get our feet back under us and we're like, oh my gosh, like, oh, I didn't know if I was going to make it through that one. But I did. And now here I am. And wow, okay, guess I'm done with waves now, right? Almost every time.
And even to this day, I'm in that logic. I get caught in that
Yeah,
logic.
yeah, yeah. No matter
Yeah.
how many times I do it, no matter how many times I've been with someone else through it, no matter how many clients I've supported through it, or even how well I do it, there's that's process is almost always similar.
Mhm.
Almost is always similar. Like I can't tell you. Like I'm about 5.5 months into the grieving process, losing my brother over Easter, and it was a shock. I had no idea that he had any kind of heart trouble. He was hiding it from us, and he wasn't taking medication that he could have been taking, and I don't think he even knew that it was going to happen. But then, just disappeared, and I've had, numerous waves now, even in the, relatively short time that it's been. But every single time I have this period, a day or even just a few hours, where I'm like, guess I'm just like this now. Never going to be anything but full of sorrow and hating everything. And then I always come out of it, and I always look back and I'm like, oh, like that part of me, I feel such tenderness toward. But there's no way to convince you that you're not going to be that way the next time it happens, the next time it comes up. It's really
Yeah.
striking.
How even as practitioners of grief work, we fall back into that logic.
Yeah. Yeah. I say this a lot to my clients, but I've never found it truer than this year that we we don't have this, we don't have an auxiliary brain to go, oh, hey, this is just like the normal thing you go through, this is like part of your process, just give it a day or a couple of hours and then you'll come through the other side. We don't have that, so we're just like, oh, I'll never get through this, it'll be like this forever every time.
This is covering your eyes is such a accurate like analogy of what we're doing
Mm-hmm.
inside of our
Yeah,
minds. Like the ostrich sticking its head in the
yeah,
sand.
yeah, except the sand is
Mhm.
hot and scary and watery.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I have such tenderness for all of us who go through that, and who each time, like we're saying, even as practitioners, we are susceptible to this. And even we find ourselves asking, am I just going to be stuck like this? Or even some version of, what's wrong with me? Why am I like, I do this work. What's wrong with me? I feel such tenderness and compassion for folks out there who don't know that. And then another wave comes and they're like, oh no, like I'm just broken. It's confirmation. And then another wave comes, oh no, well, here it is. Look, I'm never going to get over this. That can be
Mhm.
so hard. And of course, there is the truth that there's no getting over a loss that's really close to us, right? We do just live at the shore
And
now.
I yeah, and I think that the fallacy of getting over it is almost like disrespectful to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh, you need to get over this. It's
Mm-hmm.
in a sense it's emotional bypassing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder about this, and maybe this is a topic we'll get into at another time more deeply, but I wonder if part of our struggle with grieving as we experience it today is because of our cultural focus on moving toward and like making happiness such an important goal, such that if
Hmm.
we're doing grieving, even if we're doing it well, and I think letting out the tears and letting out the feelings and being with our experiences, doing it well, even if it's quite messy, but even if we're doing our grief well, we can have the sense that we're doing it wrong because we're not happy again, we're not getting over it, or we're not back to normal, or any of those kinds of things.
As though our society has definition has preconceived, not like it's not like written down, but our culture has this definition of how to grieve, and it doesn't match how to actually grieve.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like did we say this already? It's like we've been given the wrong maps.
Yeah. We said that when with debunking the
Yeah,
five
yeah,
stages of
I think
grief.
that's true. Like, in part because that stages of grief thing hangs around in our consciousness, our cultural consciousness, but also because like
Mhm.
this emphasis on happiness and our fear and increasing fear of states of uncomfortable emotion or dysregulation. The further we go toward happiness is our goal and contentment is where we're supposed to be aimed, the more I think we pathologize moments where we're not having that.
I think also individualistic nuclear family combined with capitalism is also creating this culture
Mm-hmm.
because, for example, my cousin, the sister of my cousin who passed away, had to go back to work immediately
Yes.
because she couldn't afford not to work,
Mm-hmm.
and she needed to save her time off for the funeral. And I was like, "Wait, you're going to work?" And she was like, "Yeah, I need to pay my bills. Like I have to go to work." And I was like, "Oh," and like my heart just broke for her.
Mm-hmm.
That was survival. Like survival is going back to work. And that in like a utopian society, you can take the month and your village would take care of you,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And that your village is like, "No, you just lost someone. Here, I cooked.
Yeah.
Here, I'll watch your children." But that in this like nuclear family, capitalism need money to survive. We're
Mm-hmm.
not granted space unless you are quite wealthy. And to the contrary of that, I have a friend who got like 1 month paid bereavement
Mm-hmm.
from his tech company. And I was like, "Oh, that's so great that
Yeah.
tech companies can do that. Why can't we all work for tech companies?"
Yeah. Really. Yes. Yeah. I think
Yeah.
bereavement leave is definitely something that we should have as a part of our cultural setup for anyone who's going through the loss of a loved one. It should at least
Mm-hmm.
be able to access it. I definitely have
Mm-hmm.
had an enduring sense that if I didn't have to, I would be working a lot less because grief and grieving takes so much energy and so much time and so much space, and if we're not able, for any reason, to give it the energy and time and space that it requires, we're just forestalling the process. We're just making it take a lot longer and be more painful for us in the long run. And I think that's such a disservice to each other that we have that setup. It's really a
Mm-hmm.
tragedy. You mentioned utopia. I think, yeah, that's one version is like if we got to if we move towards some higher version of our ideals in society, but also we've had that in the past. We've had like this understanding. Did we talk about the Scandinavian ancient Scandinavian practice? They called it "Year Among the Ashes." Francis Weller, I think, talks about this in his book, "The Wild Edge of Sorrow," where they were given this opportunity to, for a whole year after they lost their loved one, just tend the main fires in the log house of the little village, the group of people who were living together. And they were brought food and they were taken care of and they were tended and their kids were taken care of so that they could spend this up to a year, I think it was, just tending the fires amongst the ashes and doing the grieving process. That's such a
That's so beautiful.
Yeah. And I think many other cultures probably had similar arrangements. And what a
Yeah.
tremendous loss that we don't have anything like
Yeah.
that now.
Yeah. I want to circle back to sort of the riding the grief waves and the learning to surf and the getting good at the surfing. If you want to speak to that sort of like the what people can look forwards to if they commit to working on this journey within themselves.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that back up. Yes, I do think that part of it is some of what we've been talking about already, of recognizing that that we live at the ocean now. There's going to be waves, and our own waves are going to have their own particular flavors and ways that we experience them. And not every wave is going to be the same, but and that's part of learning to surf. And I really think that this is a metaphor that can be quite useful for us in terms of learning to navigate this thing that we're just now a part of. We're just, we're in the grieving club. How do we work our membership, And so learning, like, I think there's even learning the anatomy of waves, right? Learning the anatomy of your own waves. And we don't, I'm not talking about stages, but like what is it like for you when your wave is coming? What is it like for you when your wave gets close? What is it like for you when your wave is here? What is it like for you to be in the wave or on the wave, if you will? Like learning the anatomy of your own waves, I think is really important. So for instance, I have this interoceptive experience now. I can feel like the sense on the inside of me picking up when there's the analogy I use is like when the current starts to get pulled out before a wave comes, and like you can feel it pull you out to the sea before the wave comes. I can feel that now internally, emotionally. And it's like I'm getting full and I need to let out some of the feelings. And so I think learning the anatomy of our waves is really important for getting good at surfing. I also think learning the ways that we do best when the wave is here, right? How do we take care of ourselves when we're enduring a wave or when we're with a wave or riding a wave if we get lucky enough to be able to do that? And so that's like, well, for instance, I have hankies around now for like if I know a wave is coming up, I like go to my stack of hankies and I've got them, like nearby. Like I have a thing set up for myself. I have a partner who knows I'm going through this and who knows I can, and who I know I can go to at any time and say, hey, a wave is coming up for me. I'm feeling this. I'm noticing this. And this is what my experience is like. Will you process it with me some, or will you hold me, or just witness me? Looking for and learning about like what you need when you're in a wave. And two, I think, like another example of that is when a wave comes up for me, I need the ability to cancel some things. So like that's another thing that I know about myself that helps me ride the wave better if I can. And even if I have set up with people like if I have a tea date or a coffee date on the weekend with a friend, like know that I'm still me, still in this life doing what I'm doing now. There might be a wave up that day. And if that's the case, I might not be able to make it. And letting myself off the hook for that. Those kinds of things that help us get get through when a wave is here. Learning those. And then I think also learning to recognize that we will have that thing in the middle of the wave, even if we're riding it really well, of like, oh shit, like I'm just going to be on this wave forever. This never ends. And recognizing that that's part of it, so that we don't give ourselves a hard time or, you know, I think on some level, like even moving toward seeing ourselves as like in depression or needing some kind of medication or something because we're here again, you know. So recognizing those parts and our experience there, and then also an resourcing, like doing so much resourcing in between waves, so that we have the strength, we have the ability to swim as fast as we need to swim and hop up on the board and ride this thing as long as it takes, because it takes a lot of energy. It's strenuous, and so making sure we're resourced enough in between is vital, I think. And that
I want
includes
to,
having a time to be like, wow, like I just surfed that wave. It's beautiful on this shore. I can enjoy myself here for a minute. Like allowing ourselves those times too.
yeah, yeah, I want to add to
Yeah.
that as a menstruating person, being in tune with my 28-day cycle, I know that I'm much more likely to be going through a wave of grief during either my luteal phase or my menstrual phase. So there's four phases.
Yeah.
There's menstrual, follicular, ovulatory,
Yeah.
luteal. and it's in tune with the seasons and the cycles and it's it's like our way of being in tune with the earth,
Yes.
and knowing that I'm more likely to be there, and then knowing it is more likely to come, and if it doesn't come I'm like, oh, okay, and if it does come I'm like, oh, that makes sense, it's time. But it's very, very rare that I would be grieving and ovulating at the same time. That's like not really. I don't know if I was in acute grief within just a short amount of time after the person passing, I would be. But as I transition into more long term grief, it's very unlikely to happen.
Mm-hmm. I love that too. Yeah. So really getting to know how our own cycles interact with our grieving cycles, I think is so, so useful.
Mm-hmm.
So glad you bring that up too.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yes, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned too that in the initial, describing of this analogy, that sometimes we duck under waves. I want to talk just a little bit about that
Please.
because that does happen. And what I mean by that is just we know we can feel a wave's coming. We can feel a wave is maybe overdue, and there's that pull of the wave building. But then maybe because we don't have time to attend to it, maybe because we're working, or maybe because there are other things we need to do, or maybe because we're just so resourced, sometimes we do just duck right under the crest of that wave. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to know about those times because, for one, that does happen, and that doesn't mean that, like, okay, I'm done with waves now for the rest of my life. I just duck under these things. That's not going to be the case every time. But also, I think because even though this doesn't fit as neatly into the analogy of living at the shore, if we get into the habit of ducking under waves, we're kind of just saving them up. So, just in terms of an emotional capacity thing, you know, grief takes up a lot of room in our capacity cup. And if we don't occasionally drain it off, then that will overflow our cup at some point. It's just the way human psyches work. And so even if we knowingly duck under a wave because that's just what we need to do right now, we don't have time to attend to it, we don't have time to give it space or room, or we unknowingly duck under it because we have to get back to work and do another thing, or we're focusing on projects, or we have kids to take care of, and all the things that we do have to take care of in life. And because of what you said earlier, there's more on that list than there should be for any one of us, right? More things we have to take care of than is right for any one person to be taken care of. So if we have to duck under waves for whatever reason, and whether we're conscious of it or not, it's worth recognizing that we haven't forever avoided having to deal with that wave. It's going to come back. We'll have to deal with it at some point.
And that's how all the emotions work, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, oh, I like really don't have time to deal with this right now, I'm going to compartmentalize, distract, and sedate
Mm-hmm.
in order to get through.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get through whatever that important deadline thing was, and it's still there waiting for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the risk too is if we, I'm so glad you brought it up that that happens with all feelings, because it really does. We're like these emotional baskets, or, like containers. If we don't allow them to come up and be processed and get out of us, then we're just carrying around lots of feelings that have nowhere to go. Eventually they come out through our bodies, as you know, like in chronic
Yeah.
pain, inflammation, illness, and death, early death. Like,
Mm-hmm.
my brother was barely 50. There was no reason for him to die.
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't actually that good at working through his feelings. I don't want to blame it on that at all. Like, there are lots of things in his life, lots of things that could be at play in any one person's life in terms of how they live and how they pass. But I know that he wasn't that great at working through his feelings, and I definitely question if that had some effect on the duration and quality of his life. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know him, but in general, for that query, I would usually say, like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think. with like moral of the story, like learn to surf, feel your feelings, learn to feel your feelings. Just because they came and went once doesn't mean they're gone forever. They're coming back.
Yeah. Well put. Thank you. Hey, thanks for listening to Full-Time Grievers. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you find out when we release the next episode. If you have thoughts or questions about what we shared, please leave them in the comments below. And if this episode made you think of someone, we invite you to send it to them. They could probably use it. Also, don't forget to get your free Receiving Support While Grieving guide in the show notes below.